They called her savage before the truth ever had a chance to speak, and in that room, silence agreed with them. The courtroom in Dust Hollow smelled of old pine-wood and sun-baked dust, the kind that clung to your boots and followed you home whether you wanted it or not. Light slipped through the tall windows in thin, golden lines, catching particles in the air that drifted slow and lazy, like time itself had decided not to interfere. She stood at the center of it all, wrists bound, chin level, eyes steady, not defiant, not afraid, just present.
Elena Redbeard.
Her dark hair fell over one shoulder, a single braid tied with worn leather, the only thing about her that moved when the murmurs rose and fell like wind through dry grass. People had filled every bench, boots scraping, hats tilted back, faces set in that familiar expression that comes when judgment is made before facts ever arrive. A man near the aisle leaned forward, voice low but sharp enough to carry, said the word again like it belonged to her more than her own name ever did. Savage. It landed heavier the second time. No one corrected him. No one needed to. The prosecutor paced slowly, boots tapping against the wooden floor, each step measured, confident, rehearsed. He spoke like the story had already been written, and all that remained was for the court to nod along. Said she was found beside the body.
Said she didn't flee.
Said that kind never does things halfway. The words hung there, thick, shaping something in the minds of those listening, something easier to believe than doubt. Elena didn't answer. Not when they described her, not when they shaped her into something less than human, not even when a woman in the back shook her head and muttered under her breath, loud enough for others to hear, that justice ought to be swift for people like that.
Still she stood.
Still she breathed slow, steady, like she had learned long ago that silence could carry more weight than any defense. In the far corner, a man sat with his hat pulled low, elbows on his knees, watching. Caleb Whitmore hadn't meant to stay. He'd come for something else, business that no longer seemed to matter. His gaze didn't follow the prosecutor, didn't linger on the judge, didn't move with the shifting crowd. It stayed fixed on her. More precisely, on the thin silver chain resting against her collarbone, half hidden beneath dust and shadow. Something about it pressed at the back of his mind, a memory that hadn't fully formed yet. The prosecutor's voice rose, filling the room, building a picture that fit too neatly, too clean for a world that rarely offered such clarity. He spoke of intent, of nature, of inevitability, words that sounded like truth if you didn't look too closely. And no one did, because looking closer meant questioning what they already believed. The judge remained still behind the bench, hands folded, eyes unreadable beneath the brim of his hat resting beside him. He hadn't spoken yet, hadn't interrupted, hadn't corrected a single word. The room leaned toward a conclusion before it had even begun. Outside, a horse shifted against its reins, leather creaking softly, a reminder that the world beyond those walls still moved, still breathed, still waited. Inside, everything narrowed to one moment stretched thin. Elena finally lifted her eyes, not to the crowd, not to the prosecutor, but somewhere beyond them, as if she were looking at something only she could see. And when she spoke, her voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It didn't ask for mercy. It simply said, "I didn't run." And in a room full of noise, that quiet truth landed harder than anything that had come before. The words settled into the wood of the courtroom like dust that had been waiting years to land, and for a moment no one moved, as if even the air had paused to decide what to do with them. The prosecutor stopped mid-step, turning slowly, a faint smile touching his lips, not of amusement, but of certainty, the kind that comes from believing the ending is already written. "You did not run," he repeated, drawing the phrase out like it proved his point rather than challenged it, and a few heads in the crowd nodded, relieved to have something simple to hold on to. Because staying, in their minds, meant guilt. It always had. Elena did not look at him. Her eyes remained steady, fixed somewhere beyond the polished railings and worn benches, as though she measured something deeper than the room could contain. The chain at her neck caught a sliver of sunlight, a faint glint that flickered and disappeared with the slow shift of her breathing. Caleb noticed it again. Not the shine, not the metal, but the shape of it, the way it rested just below her throat, familiar in a way that pressed harder now, tugging at a memory that refused to stay buried. He leaned forward slightly, boots creaking against the floor, his fingers tightening against his knees without him realizing it. The prosecutor resumed his pacing, voice growing stronger, feeding off the quiet agreement in the room. He spoke of logic, of patterns, of how people like her did not act without reason, and how reason, in this case, could only lead one way. Each sentence built on the last, stacking certainty on top of assumption until it felt like truth simply because it had been said enough times. A man near the front crossed his arms, another adjusted his hat. A woman whispered to the person beside her, their voices low but steady, weaving a shared belief that required no proof. The judge shifted slightly in his chair, a small movement that went mostly unnoticed, except by Caleb, whose eyes flicked up for the briefest second before returning to the chain. Something about it was wrong in the story being told. Or maybe it was the story itself that did not fit the weight of what he remembered. The prosecutor stopped again, turning fully toward Elena now, his shadow stretching across the floor until it nearly touched her boots. "If you had nothing to hide," he said, voice calm, almost gentle, "then why were you there at all?" It was a question designed to close the door rather than open it, to guide the answer before it could be spoken. The room leaned in, waiting, not for truth, but for confirmation. Elena finally lowered her gaze, not in surrender, but in thought, as if she chose her words carefully, not for their impact, but for their honesty. When she spoke, it was quieter than before, yet somehow clearer, each syllable cutting through the layered assumptions like a blade through dry rope. "Because he asked me to stay." The sentence hung there, different from what they expected, not defensive, not pleading, just different. A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle but real, the kind that starts when something does not fit the shape people have already decided on. Caleb's breath caught, just for a second, as the memory behind that chain finally shifted, not fully formed, but close enough now to feel. Outside, the wind brushed against the side of the building, a low whisper that slipped through the cracks in the wood, carrying with it the faint scent of dry earth and distant grass. Inside, the story had begun to bend, just slightly, almost too small to notice, but enough that those paying attention could feel it, like the first sign of a storm long before the sky changes. The room did not return to what it had been before those words were spoken, even though no one said it out loud, because something small had shifted beneath the surface, something that could not be unseen once noticed. The prosecutor's expression tightened for just a fraction of a second before settling back into place, smooth and controlled, but the rhythm of his pacing changed, just slightly, as if the floor beneath him no longer felt as steady as it had a moment ago. "He asked you to stay," he repeated, slower now, weighing each word as though searching for a weakness inside it, something he could pull apart and reshape into the story he needed. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances, uncertain for the first time, not because they believed her, but because the sentence did not match the picture they had already painted. It introduced a question, and questions had no place in a room that preferred answers decided in advance. The prosecutor turned toward the jury, spreading his hands in a gesture that suggested reason, control, certainty. He spoke of desperation, of how a person might say anything in their final moments, how confusion could be mistaken for truth, how memory could bend when placed under pressure. Each explanation sounded reasonable, each one designed to smooth over the crack that had just formed, to seal it before it widened. The crowd listened, some nodding again, grateful for the familiar path being restored, for the comfort of returning to what made sense before doubt arrived. But not all of them. A man near the back shifted his weight, his boots scraping softly, his gaze no longer fixed on the prosecutor but drifting, uncertain, toward the woman standing alone at the center. The judge remained still, but his eyes had changed, no longer distant, no longer detached. He watched her now, not the crowd, not the lawyer, but her, as though measuring something he had not considered before. Caleb felt it too, that change, subtle but real, like the moment before a long-held breath is finally released. His attention sharpened, his memory pressing harder now, the image of that chain refusing to stay quiet. He had seen it before. Not in a store window, not on a stranger passing through town, but somewhere closer, somewhere that mattered. The prosecutor stepped closer to Elena, stopping just beyond the line that separated accusation from presence, his shadow once again stretching toward her boots. "If he asked you to stay," he said, voice lower now, more deliberate, "then tell us why." It sounded like an invitation, but it was not. It was a test, one designed to expose weakness, to turn her words against her if they faltered even slightly. The room leaned in again, quieter this time, not with certainty, but with something more fragile. Elena lifted her head, meeting his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged, steady as the light that still filtered through the high windows. She did not rush her answer. She did not search for approval in the faces around her. When she spoke, it came with the same calm weight as before, each word placed carefully, as though she carried them from somewhere deeper than fear. Because he knew he would not make it alone. The sentence settled into the silence differently than the others, not sharp, not defensive, but grounded, like something that did not need to prove itself to be real. The prosecutor held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then turned away, his jaw tightening as he resumed his pacing, faster now, his steps no longer measured but driven. The story he had built was still standing, but now it leaned, just enough that those watching closely could see the strain. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing against the walls in a low, steady whisper, as if the world beyond the courtroom had begun to listen more carefully than the people inside it. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt heavy, like something unseen had stepped into the room and refused to leave. The prosecutor slowed, then stopped altogether, turning his back to Elena as if distance might help him regain control over a narrative that had begun to slip through his fingers. He adjusted his coat, a small, deliberate motion, buying himself a moment to think, to reshape, to redirect. "Alone," he echoed, quieter now, almost to himself, before lifting his voice again, stronger, steadier, as though the hesitation had never existed. He began to speak of manipulation, of how trust could be misplaced, how a person in distress might reach for the nearest hand without knowing who that hand belonged to. He painted the picture carefully, brushing over the cracks, layering explanation over doubt until it almost looked solid again. Almost. But something in the room had changed, and even those who agreed with him felt it, that faint resistance beneath the surface, like a floorboard that did not sit quite right underfoot. A chair creaked somewhere to the left, louder than it should have been, drawing a few glances before attention returned to the center. Elena did not move. She did not follow his words or react to them. She simply stood, as if the truth she carried did not need reinforcement, as if it existed whether anyone chose to believe it or not. The chain at her neck shifted again with her breath, catching the light for just a second longer this time, enough for Caleb to see it clearly. Not just the chain, the pendant, a small, worn piece of silver shaped like a narrow crest, engraved with a faint line that curved like a river cutting through stone. His chest tightened. He knew that mark, not from a passing glance or a distant memory, but from something closer, something that had once rested in his own hand. His brother had worn it, not as decoration, not as wealth, but as something given, something earned. Caleb leaned forward further now, his boots scraping softly against the floor, drawing a brief glance from the man beside him before attention drifted away again. The prosecutor continued, pressing forward, his voice rising just enough to fill the room once more, reclaiming space, reclaiming certainty. He spoke of evidence that would follow, of witnesses who would confirm what had already been suggested, of facts that would settle the matter once and for all. The word facts lingered longer than the rest, spoken with emphasis, as if saying it louder made it more real. The judge shifted again, this time more noticeably, his hand moving to rest against the edge of the bench, fingers tapping once, then stilling. His gaze moved from the prosecutor to Elena, then briefly to the gallery, scanning faces that no longer held the same uniform confidence they had carried at the start. Doubt had not taken root yet, but the soil had been disturbed. That was enough. Caleb's eyes returned to the pendant, his mind no longer searching, no longer uncertain. He remembered the day his brother had shown it to him, holding it up against the sunlight just like this, saying it had been given by someone who chose to stay when others would not. Someone who did not walk away. The memory settled into place with a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. His breath slowed, his posture straightened, and for the first time since he had entered the room, he looked not just at Elena, but at what she represented in the story unfolding before him. The prosecutor's voice faded slightly at the edges, not because it had grown softer, but because something else had begun to rise, something quieter but stronger, like the beginning of a truth that no longer intended to stay hidden. And in that growing stillness, the distance between what was being said and what was real became just wide enough for someone to step through. The space between certainty and truth had narrowed to something almost visible, like heat rising off dry ground, and Caleb could feel it pressing against him now, demanding more than silence. He did not stand immediately. That was not his way. Instead, he let the memory settle fully, let it take shape without forcing it, because once it was spoken, it would not return to where it had been. The courtroom carried on around him, the prosecutor's voice steady again, confident enough to fill the gaps with familiar rhythm, repeating words like intent and nature, as if repetition alone could rebuild what had begun to fracture. A few in the gallery nodded once more, though slower now, their agreement less certain, their eyes shifting more often than before. Elena remained still, her breathing even, her presence unchanged, as though she stood outside the weight of their judgment entirely. The chain rested against her skin, no longer just an object, but a quiet witness to something none of them had yet understood. Caleb exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but enough for the man beside him to glance over again, curious this time. Caleb did not return the look. His gaze had already moved forward, past the benches, past the rail, to the center of the room where everything that mattered now stood waiting. He rose, not abruptly, not with force, but with a kind of steadiness that drew attention without asking for it. The scrape of his boots against the wooden floor cut through the prosecutor's voice just enough to pause it, just enough to shift the room's focus in a single, quiet motion. Heads turned, not all at once, but one after another, like a ripple moving across still water. The prosecutor stopped mid-sentence, irritation flickering across his face before it was masked again by practiced control. The judge's eyes lifted, narrowing slightly as they settled on the man who had not spoken until now. Caleb removed his hat, holding it low at his side, not as a gesture of submission, but of respect for the space he was about to step into. "That pendant," he said, his voice even, carrying clearly without needing to rise, "it does not belong to a story you are telling." A murmur moved through the room, uncertain, curious, cautious. The prosecutor straightened, ready to object, but hesitated, something in Caleb's tone holding him back for just a moment longer than it should have. Caleb took a step forward then. Another, each one deliberate, closing the distance between observation and involvement. "I have seen it before," he continued, his eyes now on the judge, not the crowd, not the prosecutor, but the one man in the room whose decision would outlast every word spoken here. "It was given to my brother." The words landed differently than anything that had come before, not because they were louder, but because they carried weight that did not need explanation. The room shifted again, more noticeably this time, the quiet no longer comfortable, no longer certain. The prosecutor opened his mouth, then closed it, recalculating, searching for ground that felt solid. Caleb's grip tightened slightly on his hat, the memory now fully formed, no longer a question, no longer a doubt. "He told me once," Caleb added, slower now, each word measured, "that it came from someone who stayed when leaving would have been easier." His gaze moved then, finally, to Elena, not with suspicion, not with distance, but with recognition. He said she did not run. The silence that followed was no longer passive. It waited. And for the first time since the trial had begun, the story in the room no longer belonged to the man who had been speaking the longest. The words did not fade when he finished speaking, they settled, deep and unmoving, like something placed carefully where it could not be ignored. For a moment, no one breathed loud enough to be heard. The prosecutor's composure cracked just slightly, not enough to draw accusation, but enough to be seen by those paying attention. He stepped forward, reclaiming space with a practiced motion, his voice returning sharper now, more controlled, as though he needed it to hold the room together. "A story," he said, turning toward Caleb with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes, "is not evidence." The statement was firm, familiar, something the crowd could hold on to again. A few nodded, grateful for the return to structure, to rules they understood. But the words did not carry the same weight as before. Something had changed. The judge leaned back slightly, fingers steepled now, his gaze moving between the two men, measuring not just what was said, but how it was said, how it landed. Caleb did not react to the challenge. He did not raise his voice or step closer. He simply remained where he stood, steady, grounded, like a man who had already decided which truth he would carry regardless of what followed. "Then look at it," he replied, quieter this time, but clearer, each word placed with intention. "Look at it the way you would if it belonged to someone you knew." The room shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Enough that the prosecutor hesitated before responding. Enough that the certainty he had been building began to feel less solid beneath him. He turned sharply toward Elena, seizing control the only way he knew how. "If that pendant is what he claims," he said, his tone tightening, "then explain how it came into your possession." It was not a question meant to open truth. It was a demand, one designed to corner, to force a misstep, to expose something that could be turned back into the narrative he needed. The room leaned forward once more, but differently now, not with expectation of guilt, but with the fragile tension of uncertainty. Elena did not flinch. She did not look to Caleb or to the judge or to anyone who might offer her support. She stood alone, as she had from the beginning, her voice carrying the same calm weight that had unsettled them before. "He gave it to me," she said. Simple.
Direct. No embellishment.
The prosecutor's eyes narrowed. "Why?" he pressed, stepping closer, his shadow stretching toward her again. This time, the room felt the pressure in the question, felt the intent behind it. Elena's gaze lifted slightly, not in defiance, but in clarity, as if she understood exactly what they needed and what they would do with it once they had it. "Because I stayed when no one else did," she answered. The words did not rise. They did not strike. They settled, firm and undeniable, filling the space in a way no argument had managed to do. Caleb's grip on his hat loosened just slightly, the confirmation landing where the memory had already led him. The judge's posture changed again, almost imperceptibly, but enough that those closest to the bench noticed the shift. The way his shoulders straightened, the way his attention sharpened, no longer passive, no longer distant. The prosecutor opened his mouth, ready to respond, ready to push forward, but for the first time since the trial began, the words did not come immediately. They hovered, uncertain, caught between what had been built and what was now breaking through it. Outside, the wind moved stronger now, brushing against the walls with a steady rhythm, like something waiting for the moment the truth would finally be allowed to stand without being spoken over. And inside, that moment was closer than anyone had expected. The room no longer held a single version of the story, it held two, and they did not fit together. One had been built carefully, word by word, shaped by assumption and repeated until it sounded like truth. The other stood quietly, carried in a few simple sentences that refused to bend. And now they pressed against each other in the same space, forcing everyone inside it to choose which one felt real. The prosecutor exhaled slowly, regaining his footing not through certainty, but through urgency, because hesitation in a room like this could cost everything. He turned sharply toward the bench, then back again, shifting his stance as though movement alone could restore control. "Staying," he said, his voice firm again, though no longer as effortless, "does not make one innocent." The statement landed, but it did not settle. It hovered, waiting for something stronger to anchor it, something that did not come. A few in the crowd shifted in their seats, boots scraping softly against the floor, the sound louder now in a silence that had grown too aware of itself. The judge did not interrupt. He did not guide. He watched. And that watching carried weight because it meant the moment had not passed. It meant the decision had not been made. The prosecutor turned back to Elena, his gaze sharper now, more direct, as though he needed to force clarity where doubt had taken hold. "You expect this court to believe," he said, each word measured, "that you remained out of kindness alone?" It was not disbelief in his tone, it was challenge, the kind that demanded justification, that required explanation detailed enough to be questioned again. Elena did not rush to answer. Her silence stretched, not empty, but full, as though she allowed the question to settle properly before she touched it. When she finally spoke, her voice carried something different now, not stronger, not louder, but deeper, like it came from a place untouched by the room around her.
"Not kindness," she said.
A pause, just long enough to shift the meaning. Responsibility. The word moved through the courtroom in a way the others had not, because it did not argue, it did not defend, it simply existed, and in doing so, it asked something of everyone listening. Caleb felt it settle beside the memory he already held, aligning with it, completing it. His brother had not spoken of kindness either. He had spoken of someone who did what was right without asking what it would cost. The prosecutor opened his mouth again, ready to dismantle the word, to pull it apart and reshape it into something that fit his case, but he stopped. Just for a second, because the room had shifted once more, and this time it was not subtle. The certainty he had relied on was no longer shared by everyone present. A man near the front uncrossed his arms. A woman who had whispered earlier now sat still, her gaze fixed forward, no longer speaking. Even the air seemed to hold differently, heavier, as if the truth had begun to take form whether they welcomed it or not. The judge leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the bench now, his posture no longer distant. His eyes remained on Elena, studying not just her words, but the space around them, the way they changed the room itself. Outside, a distant sound of wind carried across the open land, brushing against the walls in a steady rhythm that felt almost deliberate. Inside, the line between accusation and understanding had thinned to something fragile. And for the first time, it was not clear which side would hold. The word responsibility did not leave the room when she spoke it. It stayed, settling into the corners, pressing against every assumption that had been laid down before it. The prosecutor felt it, even if he did not show it at first. He turned away again, slower this time, as though each step required more effort than the last, his mind working through angles that no longer aligned the way they had when the morning began. He had built his case on something simple, something familiar, something the town could accept without question. But simplicity had begun to crack under the weight of something real. He stopped near the jury, placing one hand against the back of a chair, grounding himself. "Responsibility," he repeated, the word sharper now, almost forced, as if saying it differently might change what it meant. "You speak of it as though it absolves you." His voice carried again, but the confidence behind it had shifted, no longer effortless, no longer unquestioned. Elena did not respond immediately. She did not fill the space to defend the word. She allowed it to remain as it was, complete without explanation. The room waited, not impatiently, but carefully, as if any movement might break something that had only just begun to take shape. Caleb watched her, not searching anymore, not questioning, but listening in a way he had not before. The memory of his brother stood beside him now, clear and steady, not as a story told long ago, but as something present, something alive in the space between what had been said and what was still unspoken. The judge leaned forward further, his hands now flat against the bench, his posture no longer removed from the moment. He had listened to arguments before, to words crafted to persuade, to stories shaped for outcome. This felt different. This felt like something that did not need shaping. The prosecutor turned back once more, urgency pushing him now, not strategy. "If you stayed," he said, his tone tightening, "then tell this court what happened." The demand was clear, but it no longer held the same control. It was not guiding the truth. It was asking for it. Elena lifted her gaze slightly, not to meet his challenge, but to acknowledge the moment itself. When she spoke, her voice carried no strain, no hesitation, only the quiet weight of something that had been carried alone for longer than anyone in that room had considered. "He could not stand," she
said.
The sentence was simple, but it changed the shape of everything around it. "He asked for water. I brought it. He asked me to stay. So I did."
No embellishment.
No defense. Just truth, placed plainly where everyone could see it. The prosecutor's shoulders tightened, his next words delayed, not by choice, but by the realization that the ground beneath him had shifted too far to ignore. The story he had told no longer held on its own. It needed more, and more was no longer his to control. A man in the gallery lowered his head slightly, his earlier certainty gone. The woman who had whispered before now sat still, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed forward, no longer searching for confirmation. Caleb drew a slow breath, the final piece settling into place, the memory and the truth aligning without conflict. His brother had not been saved by strength or force. He had been saved by someone who chose not to leave. The judge's gaze moved across the room, taking in each face, each shift, each silence that had replaced the earlier noise. Then it returned to Elena. He studied her for a long moment, not as a defendant, not as a symbol, but as a person standing in front of him with nothing but the truth she had carried. Outside, the wind slowed, the sound softening against the walls, as if the world itself had paused. Inside, the distance between what had been claimed and what was real had closed completely. And in that stillness, the decision was no longer waiting to be argued. It was waiting to be recognized. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was settled, like dust after a long wind has finally laid itself down. No one spoke. Not the prosecutor, not the crowd, not even the restless shifting of boots that had filled the room before. It was as if every sound had stepped back to make space for something else. The judge remained still for a long moment, his hands resting against the worn wood of the bench, fingers no longer tapping, no longer searching for rhythm. He looked at Elena, not quickly, not briefly, but with the kind of attention that comes when a man knows the weight of what he is about to do. Then slowly he stood. The movement was quiet, but it carried across the room like a bell no one could ignore. Chairs creaked as people adjusted without realizing it, eyes lifting, breath catching in places that had been certain only minutes before. The prosecutor straightened instinctively, as though expecting words, a ruling, a declaration that would restore order to what had slipped beyond his reach. But the judge did not speak. He removed his hat instead, holding it against his chest, his gaze never leaving Elena. There was no anger in his expression.
No hesitation.
Only recognition. The kind that does not need explanation. Caleb felt it before he understood it. That shift from judgment to something deeper, something older than the law written in books. The judge stepped down from the bench, one slow step at a time, the sound of his boots against the floor measured and deliberate, until he stood level with her. Close enough now that the distance between them no longer carried authority, only truth. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The room held its breath again, but differently this time, not waiting for a verdict, but for meaning. Then the judge lifted his hand. Not high, not dramatic, just enough.
A salute. Simple. Steady.
Final. It was not the kind given to rank or power. It was the kind given to something earned. Something understood. Something that had stood its ground, when leaving would have been easier. The gesture hung in the air longer than any sentence could have, filling the space with a weight no argument had managed to carry. No one spoke because there was nothing left to argue. The prosecutor lowered his gaze first, his hands falling to his sides, the structure he had built no longer standing in the face of what had just been acknowledged. The crowd followed slowly, not all at once, but enough that the room no longer felt like it belonged to judgment. It belonged to something quieter, something more honest. Elena did not bow her head. She did not step forward or back. She simply stood, the same way she had from the beginning, steady and present, as if nothing about her had changed, even though everything around her had. The chain at her neck rested still now, no longer catching light, no longer needing to. Caleb exhaled, a breath he had not realized he was holding, his grip on his hat loosening completely as the last piece settled into place. Outside, the wind had gone still. The world beyond the walls waited, open and unchanged. Inside, the truth no longer needed to be spoken. It had been seen, and out here that was enough.